Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Homeland Defense and Security Information Analysis Center webinar titled Historical Significance of Endemic Infectious Diseases and Loss of Warfighter Combat Effectiveness. My name is Steve Redifer, and I have the pleasure of being the director of the HDIAC, and today we're hosting Dr. Tim Indy for today's presentation. So just a couple housekeeping notes as we begin this. Please note that all the lines have been muted, so if you have a question for Dr. Indy during the webinar, you can submit those using the chat box that you see on the right hand of the screen. We'll try to save the last 10 or 15 minutes or so of the presentation for those questions as well as any discussion that our listeners may wish to have. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded. A link for the recording as well as these slides will be available at our website, www.hdiac.org, again, www.hdiac.org for later download. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Tim Indy. Dr. Indy is a professor and the chair of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at State University of New York, Upstate Medical University, following a successful career in the United States Army where he retired as a colonel. Tim has been involved in all aspects of basic science and clinical research with a focus on dengue and emerging viruses for the past 25 years. He is currently the principal investigator of the dengue human infection model and one of the project directors for the NIH P01 grant on flavivirus pathogenesis being conducted at Guardian Center's field site in Thailand. Tim has over 20 years of experience in performing phase 1 through 3 vaccine efficacy trials as well as prospective and surveillance studies. Tim has his Bachelor of Science in Biology from Pennsylvania State University, his Master of Public Health and Epidemiology from University of Michigan, and his Doctor of Medicine from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Tim completed both his residency and later a fellowship at Walter Reed Army National Military Medical Center. We're excited to have him sharing his expertise with us today, and with that, we'll pass it over to Tim.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone this afternoon. If you have any issues of hearing me, please let me know. But as Steve mentioned, in the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about some of the historical significance of emerging infectious diseases as it relates to warfighter combat effectiveness. And this lecture combines two of my passions, which is military history and infectious diseases. We'll have some questions at the end, but if you have any burning questions through the presentation, feel free to ask them. So the learning objectives in the next 45 minutes really is to kind of give us a historical significance and review of infectious disease-related combat injuries and deaths. We'll be starting with World War I and the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, which will also lead us into current-day outbreaks, including SARS, MERS, and a little bit of a brief explanation of the Wuhan coronavirus. We'll talk about dengue and U.S. Marine forces in Saipan during World War II, as well as dengue outbreaks in U.S. forces during operations in Haiti and Somalia. A little bit of a discussion on malaria outbreak in U.S. Marines deployed to Monrovia, Africa, a rabies case in Afghanistan, leishmaniasis and multi-drug resistant bacteria in U.S. forces during the Iraq War, and then kind of sum it up with lessons learned for future deployments will be discussed at the end. From a personal note, for dengue outbreaks in Haiti and Somalia, the malaria outbreak in U.S. Marines, the rabies patient in Afghanistan, and the leishmaniasis and multi-drug resistant, I have all been personally involved with. The rabies patient who passed away was a patient here at Upstate, which I was one of the team members taking care of that patient. So if you have any particular questions about any of this, please ask it at the end. The National Academy of Sciences was commissioned to do a report on infectious disease threats to U.S. warfighters and our readiness in terms of vaccine development. In this 2002 report, they concluded that infectious agents remain a substantial threat to the operational capacity of U.S. military forces for three very important reasons. One is that recruits continue to train in groups under crowded conditions, which increase the risk of spread of infectious agents. For those of you who are in the South, like in Fort Bragg, for example, adenovirus continues to be a problem, and troops undergoing training. Number two, deployed warfighters, whether on combat or peacekeeping missions, continue to come in contact with infectious pathogens which really don't have much in the way of prior experience. And when we say that is basically they don't have any immunity to these pathogens. So they're basically, from an immunological standpoint, virgins who then meet infectious disease threats and become infected. And number three, warfighters, along with others, face an increasing risk of the intentional use of weaponized infectious agents. And that latter point will be a talk in the future in terms of biological weapons and biological weapon threats. So what is the historical significance? Well, it really goes back to 300 BC when Alexander the Great, which is a great story, just as he was about to achieve world supremacy, died at the age of 32 from either typhoid or malaria. Napoleon the Great in 1798 halted his global dominance in his Egyptian campaign when his troops were decimated by an outbreak of a bubonic plague. George Washington in 1777 ordered the mass vaccination of congressional soldiers to stop the smallpox outbreak, which actually increased their combat effectiveness and probably changed the course of the war with Britain. During the Spanish-American War of 1898, U.S. forces invaded Cuba. Fewer than 400 American soldiers were killed in actual combat, but more than 2,000 contracted yellow fever and were combat non-effective. American combat deaths in World War I totaled 53,402, but 45,000 American soldiers died of influenza and related pneumonia by the end of 1918, almost 50%. During World War II, malaria and dengue were significant causes of soldier illness. 80% of soldiers stationed in Australia to get deployed into the Pacific Theater came down with acute dengue fever, and 100% of soldiers on the Solomon Islands became ill from dengue. During the Korean War, a new illness was identified, Hantan fever with renal syndrome, causing several thousand hospitalizations and deaths. And during the Vietnam War, there were outbreaks of malaria, dengue, typhoid fever, and a bacterial infection called melioidosis. Conflicts in Haiti and Somalia resulted in large outbreaks of dengue. The Iraq War resulted in several thousand cases of cutaneous leishmaniasis and an outbreak of multi-drug-resistant Acinetobacter infections. So on this slide, which was published by Dave Morans and company in 2004, showed the past decade outbreaks that were occurring globally. This has been updated since then with 2 Ebola outbreaks, outbreaks of yellow fever, and of course the Wuhan coronavirus. But you can see that there have been outbreaks of bacterial infections, including E. coli. There was hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. There was both a Marburg and Ebola hemorrhagic fever outbreaks. West Nile went through North America as well as through the Caribbean. And as you can appreciate from this is a global problem. And you can also appreciate that any deployed forces to these areas of operations will be susceptible and exposed to these emerging infectious disease threats. Factors involved in the emergence of infectious diseases are many, and they include the rapid microbial adaptation and change evolve so that they can rapidly evolve to new hosts and vectors. Humans become more susceptible to infections. There are certainly elements of climate and weather change and changing ecosystems. The rapid deployment of people, so you can go from Beijing, China to North America in a matter of 16 hours, get anywhere in the world in a matter of 24 hours. Poverty, breakdown of public health measures, war, all contribute to the emergence of infectious diseases. This is a great book that I use in some of my classes by Jared Diamond called Guns, Germs, and Steel. If you have time on deployment and have nothing else to do, this is a great read. But I think what's important about this is the concept that most of the pathogens that afflict us today that we consider human pathogens actually started out as animal pathogens. And at some point in their history of evolution, they jumped from animals to humans. So among animals, too, epidemic diseases require dense populations. We live close to the domesticated animals, and as such, we get constantly emergence of infectious disease threats. The Wuhan coronavirus, of course, started in a animal population with infection in a market, as well as most of the coronaviruses in SARS. So let's start back during World War I, review the influenza outbreak at that point in time. So this is another great book by Alfred Crosby, which described the 1918 epidemic. And during that time, it was really a pandemic of influenza, which they called at the time Spanish flu. The United States was training a mass amount of soldiers to send over to support the expeditionary force with Britain and France. And Camp Devens in Massachusetts was a training ground of the 12th Infantry Division. Consisted of 45,000 men training, an encampment built for 35,000 people. As we talk about flu, the teaching points is that influenza is really an animal virus. It's a bird virus. Human epidemic influenza is caused by both types A and B. Epidemics are the consequences of changing in the virus itself, so that a new type of strain evolves and spreads every year, which is why we have to get a influenza vaccine every year. Pandemic, which is a global spread, is unpredictable but results in major changes in the genetic structure of the flu virus. And then there have been cases of direct transmission from birds to humans called avian influenza. This is a nice cartoon of the virus itself. And the important thing about the flu, this just shows a natural course of influenza in a human infected. So they get exposed to the virus. There's an incubation period. What's important about this is the fever temperature here on day number 2 of illness. They start developing sore throat, muscle aches, headache. We've all had the flu, so you're quite aware of the symptoms. But the important thing here is this last point, is the amount of virus being shed. So a person is shedding tremendous amounts of virus before they become symptomatic, which means that they're infecting people as they go to the grocery store, as they go on deployment in the barracks, and then not until they're ill do they realize that they have the flu, and they've already infected many people by the time they become clinically ill. This just shows the severity of this, giving you a very severe pneumonia by chest x-ray. So let's go back to Camp Devens. This is pictures of Camp Devens in 1918. There was massive amounts of construction to hold all the soldiers. Soldiers were sleeping in gymnasiums. You can tell they were overcrowded, very little space between individuals. The first case of influenza was reported at Camp Devens on September 14th, which is shown on the red dots here. Within a week, they said it spread throughout the state and local states. By the following week, shown in yellow, there was spread through the eastern seaboard. By the 21st and 28th of September, it had gone all along the eastern seaboard, and by October 5th, it had spread throughout the United States. This is 1918, so there wasn't rapid transportation, and you got a flu epidemic that spread within 4 weeks to go across the United States. For U.S. soldiers who went to France to fight, this shows the numbers by the end of the year. The Americans experienced in September almost 38,000 flus with 3,500 pneumonia admissions. In October, they had 38,000, and by November, it was 22,000, with a mortality rate of between 6 and 12%. So within 3 months alone, there was almost 8,000 deaths. This would then spread into the British forces and the French forces. Many of the units became combat non-effective because of influenza, probably contributed to the duration of the war. So in summary, flu is a zoonosis, which means it's spread by animals, primarily by birds. There's a constant evolution, so it's constantly reemerging as a new type of a virus every year. It can produce pandemics, and troop overcrowding, poor sanitation, and stress of war can contribute to large outbreaks in soldiers. Protect soldiers, minimize overcrowding, influenza vaccine every year, and prompt reporting and isolation from crowded areas, especially in the troop barracks. Wanted to touch upon emerging respiratory threats to the warfighter. So the coronavirus is a newly recognized pathogen in humans. Started with SARS, or the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which was noted to be in the Guangdong province in China in 2002. Within 6 months, it had left China and had spread throughout Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and then because of the number of Chinese Canadians that were visiting at the time through the New Year's, they brought the outbreak back to Toronto. So there were several hundred cases of SARS in Toronto. Laboratories quickly diagnosed this as a very new virus called the coronavirus. It was really the first reported outbreak of human coronavirus producing a pneumonia in humans. And it was largely thought to have jumped from animals to humans and caused really by the closeness of humans in a market and infected animals. There's also a very large secondary attack rate in healthcare providers. So a sick patient visiting his doctor infected the waiting room and infected the healthcare providers who were caring for that patient. This is an electron micrograph of the coronavirus. Cartoon of that here. And then within a matter of a year from China, it spread throughout Southeast Asia, through North America, and became a pandemic. This shows the epidemic curve, which reached a peak in April of 2003 and sustained, and then eventually died off. This just shows one typical SARS patient who had a chest X-ray, and if those who haven't looked at chest X-rays, air should be black, so there is plenty of air in both lungs, and the white represents fluid, and you can show that this patient had severe, what we call acute respiratory distress syndrome, showing a very severe multifocal pneumonia. So SARS is an example of a disease that had emerged, a brand new virus in humans, jumped from animal to man, a clinical picture that was indistinguishable from influenza. This is important as we think about the outbreak currently, because the United States has a very large influenza outbreak currently. There's a rapid spread because of air transportation of infected individuals, and there was really a tremendous economic loss and social disruption that was associated with SARS. Several years later, there was another jump from animals to human called Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS-CoV coronavirus. And this is a reservoir in camels. So no one have any camels at home, please. But it caused, first isolated in the Sudan, quickly spread throughout northern Africa, large outbreaks in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and there's still very prominent ongoing outbreaks of MERS that's occurring in the Middle East, where soldiers are deployed. It's a clinical syndrome undistinguishable from SARS, causing a respiratory infection and pneumonia. And of course, now we have the Wuhan coronavirus. I put this slide up as of February 4th, 2020, because this is evolving every day. So I think the latest figures have been, 1,000 deaths in China, something like 50,000 cases, and then cases that are throughout now. In Thailand, there are 33 cases now. There are 3 cases in the United States. So Wuhan coronavirus is going the route of SARS, and it'll be very interesting to see how this pathogen plays out, if it'll die out like SARS did, or that it'll continue to be a respiratory pathogen that will affect humans. I should also note that there is no vaccine available or therapeutic available for any of the coronaviruses. So World War II had unique infectious disease threats. It was a complex because of the different theaters that were involved. So during the European theater here, there were different pathogens that were causing problems in U.S. forces. For example, in northern Africa, during the North African invasion, there were problems with bacterial infections, including Salmonella and Shigella, as well as leishmaniasis, we'll talk about later. During the invasion of Italy, Italy had actually wiped out malaria from the southern tip of Italy, but German forces, as they were pulling back, broke the water that held the dikes available, flooding the plains. That was basically intent was to slow down U.S. forces, but also brought back malaria. So malaria outbreaks occurred in U.S. soldiers as they were going up through Italy. In the Pacific theater, there was a whole unique set of problems, primarily because of dengue, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So dengue is a very important pathogen. It's a global pandemic currently. It's a mosquito-borne infection, primarily by a tropical mosquito called Aedes aegypti, but also by its cousin Aedes albopictus. That mosquito is important because it transmits such important pathogens such as yellow fever, chikungunya, which some of you might have read about, which has caused a large outbreak in South America and the Caribbean. And then most recently, Aedes aegypti has spread Zika virus, which you've all read about. Dengue in itself is a global health problem. There's something like 390 million infections per year. On its first infection, it presents like a very severe flu, but there are 4 different serotypes, so you can get another infection. On that second infection can lead to very severe dengue and a bleeding disorder, as well as a lowering of the blood pressure and shock. It's actually the most common cause of fever in returning travelers to the United States. I think last year alone in New York State, there were 80 cases of dengue from people coming back from the Sandals Resort in Dominican Republic. So if you're planning your spring vacation right now to the Caribbean, there's a large outbreak, I think almost 300 cases in Jamaica right now, as well as a number of different Caribbean countries experiencing dengue outbreaks. There is one vaccine that was licensed in the United States by Sanofi Pasteur. The Army helped develop that vaccine, but it was really a failure during clinical trials, and it's been only effective in people who've had previous dengue infections. So for travelers and U.S. soldiers, it's really not a very good vaccine at all. And there are at least 3 others that are active in clinical trials, but no licensed other vaccines currently. The dengue is actually very important historically in the United States. So there was a large outbreak of dengue in Philadelphia in 1780. There was large outbreaks of dengue in the 1800s throughout the U.S. coastal cities, including New Orleans. Currently, there are still periodic outbreaks of dengue in Texas, which crosses the Mexican border. There was a large Hawaii Island outbreak in 2001 and then 3 years ago. If we go back to World War II, well, if you even go back before that, we knew dengue was a problem when soldiers were deployed to the Philippine Islands in the early 1900s. There was an average loss of almost 7,000 combat effective days per year because of dengue fever. And then during World War II, there was large outbreaks throughout the deployment of soldiers in the South Pacific. Almost 50,000 soldiers came down with dengue in a matter of 4 years, plus outbreaks in China, Burma, India, as well as in the Middle East. This shows the epidemic curve in soldiers deployed in Saipan, with very large outbreaks occurring during the peak dengue seasons in April, May, June, and July. This just shows the daily reported cases during the Saipan dengue epidemic in 1944, with 393 cases occurring just on one day alone, September 14th, with a total number of cases in the thousands. Recent U.S. military experience with dengue has been significant. It was a major cause of outbreaks in Vietnam. There are almost 289 soldiers hospitalized during the deployment in Somalia in 1992. Several hundred cases, almost 400 hospital admissions from the deployment of soldiers during the Haiti operation in 1997. So dengue is a virus that's spread by mosquitoes, as I mentioned, and it occurs as 4 different serotypes, which means you can get infected 4 different times. But the second infection really results in very severe dengue. This shows the distribution, and it's basically all the tropical and subtropical areas of the world now are endemic for dengue. So that soldiers deployed to Central America, to tropical Africa, Southeast Asia, to the Middle East, all are susceptible to getting dengue infections. This is just 2 pictures of Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. Both of them are female mosquitoes, which are the only ones that take the blood meal and can potentially infect you with dengue. And this just shows the life cycle. So it's not a human-to-human transmission. It's human to mosquito back to human again. So that if you can disrupt that transmission pattern by eliminating the mosquito or by preventing the mosquito from biting you through the use of things like DEET, insect repellents, or permethrin-impregnated battle uniforms, those are all very effective in reducing your exposure to dengue and mosquito bites. This is pictures of children in our clinical trials showing basically bleeding disorder with blood underneath the skin from severe dengue hemorrhagic fever. This is what we call petechiae. They can scatter down the arms after because of the fragility of the capillary system. And in most serious cases, they can bleed into the stomach, the GI tract, and then cause very severe respiratory and shock, which, if not treated properly, can result in a mortality rate of about 10%. So how do we protect soldiers from DEET? Well, there's still no effective vaccine or therapeutic, though we are here at Upstate supporting several military efforts to develop a new vaccine and therapeutics for that. In the meantime, you can tell your soldiers to wear DEET or picaridine, long sleeves and pants, very hard to do in a tropical environment, screens on windows, eliminating water sources in the area of deployment in the barracks areas around homes, which are perfect breeding areas for mosquitoes, insecticide program, and then to realize that this particular mosquito feeds during the day, so that maximize protection during daytime activities and deployment. Takes us to the Korean War. So the Korean War resulted in a massive invasion from North Korea to South. Basically, U.S. forces were pushed all the way back to the tip of the peninsula. Then forces were able to regain footage back through the province of South Korea. But deployment was particularly hard, so U.S. forces and UN forces were exposed to freezing temperatures during the winter, very hot environment during the summer. It was combat fatigue, stresses of deployment, and military physicians taking care of soldiers there noticed a new type of disease, which they call the hemorrhagic fever, which occurred primarily in U.S. forces. So soldiers became febrile and quickly went into renal failure and developed a hemorrhagic fever. There were so many battle injuries that was resulting in a loss of combat effectiveness. The Far East Command Surgeon, Brigadier General Chambord, convened a symposium basically stating that the symptoms of malaise or fatigue, weakness, fever, headaches was a serious military problem and resulted in, by this point, several hundred cases of hemorrhagic fever in U.S. soldiers. The epidemic really, over the period of 2 years, resulted in almost 3,000 cases of Korean hemorrhagic fever, which they called it, which resulted in development of MASH units which was specifically designed to treat soldiers with Korean and hemorrhagic fever. Renal failure, shock, and death occurred in almost 15% of cases. And it really wasn't until 1967 that the virus was isolated, was found to be a virus called the hantavirus, which was named after where it was isolated, the Hantan River in Korea. So hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, or what we call HFRS, is actually produced by a virus called hantavirus, and it's spread through the infection of rodents. The rodents will then urinate the virus into areas where soldiers are sleeping or eating, and they get affected by aerosolized virus from the urine. Clinical course is characterized by severe fever, headache. They develop a rash. It infects the kidneys, so they go into renal failure, and then they go into shock. So, in summary, this is another emerging infection that affected U.S. forces during combat operations, with significant military disease during the Korean War. It's still a problem for soldiers deployed out to Korea. Military sciences really contribute to our identifying this particular virus. Now there is some antiviral drugs and a very good protocol to decrease mortality less than 1%. Also note there are other very important viral hemorrhagic fever viruses that are potential threats to U.S. forces. They've also been weaponized as bioterrorism threats. This includes viruses such as this, the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, or CCHF, which is endemic through Equatorial Africa as well as in Europe. Ebola hemorrhagic fever, and as we know, this past year there was a very large outbreak in tropical areas of Africa. Rift Valley fever, which also is another African virus. Yellow fever has been ongoing in outbreaks in South America currently here. There's a very good vaccine for yellow fever, so soldiers deploying to these areas that are experiencing or endemic for yellow fever should be vaccinated. That includes deployments to South America as well as tropical areas in Africa. So the Iraq War. The Iraq War presented unique problems. This was a soldier that presented to us at Walter Reed. He was a 22-year-old black male, sergeant first class, otherwise good health, deployed in Iraq, north of Baghdad for 6 months. No acute illnesses while in Iraq, but he did notice numerous insect bites along his exposed areas of his arms because he had his combat fatigues rolled up, as well as around the ankle areas when he took his boots off. And then he noticed some distinct papules that formed here. They were a little bit itchy, but then they grew and would break open and then scab over. And eventually formed a very large ulceration. This was on the forearm. This was diagnosed as a parasitic infection called leishmaniasis, which is a parasite spread by the sandfly. And in this particular case, it's called cutaneous leishmaniasis, or CL. Another U.S. Army Special Forces soldier who presented to the Troop Medical Clinic in Bagram and had a two-week history of expanding ulcer on the back of his leg. The problem with this is that it can be painful. And this can really contribute to combat non-effectiveness because this occurs right above the boot line. They can get infected because of deployments. It's not necessarily a hygiene environment, so they'll get super infected with bacterial infections. It can result in soldiers losing combat effective days, especially as they're getting treated or air evac back to the United States. This parasite can actually produce 3 different syndromes. One is an infection in the organs themselves, which is called visceral leishmaniasis. Infection of the skin, called cutaneous. And then in South America, it can infect the mucosal surfaces, called mucosal leishmaniasis. This shows the global distribution which really occurs in the Middle East, tropical Africa, as well as in tropical portions of South America. The mucocutaneous, in particular, can occur in Central America, as well as the tropical areas of South America. Then cutaneous leash is highly endemic through all the areas that we just discussed, including the Middle East. These are typical examples and presentations of the types of ulcerations that can occur with this parasitic infection. This. And it can present in a variety of different ways. These are more papules with central areas of ulceration. Then dry papules like this. Once healed, they actually leave significant scarring behind, so there could be a lot of deformity involved once the lesions have healed. So as a military threat, it was a problem during World War II. So British soldiers deployed in Iraq had 630 cases. The IDF, during the Jericho deployment, there was a 50% attack rate of leishmaniasis. Amongst Puerto Rican National Guard, during the Joint Operations Training Camp in Panama, there was 22% cases of cutaneous leash, and then there were 484 cases in a Guatemalan army. During the MNF deployment in Sinai, there were 113 cases of CL. 62% attack rate amongst Canadian paratroopers. And then these are all air vac to Walter Reed. In 1992, there was a deployment of jungle training in French Guiana, and almost half the soldiers there developed a cutaneous leash and had to be air vac back. During Operation Desert Storm, there were 20 cases of cutaneous leash and 12 cases of the more severe viscerotropic. And then during Iraq II, there are almost 2,000 cases of cutaneous leash, about 1,000 cases that were treated during the last significant part of deployment. This shows the epidemic curve of that particular outbreak. All these soldiers were air vac back to Walter Reed for treatment, so they were basically combat non-effective. So cutaneous disease was a significant problem during the Iraqi war, as well as the more severe cases of visceral disease. So there's good news is that there is treatment available to treat both cutaneous and visceral leishmaniasis. These treatments are not available to forward deployed soldiers, so they all have to be air vac back to a medical treatment facility, which means that they're taken out of the area of operation. How do we protect soldiers? Well, the sandfly is tenacious. It's a daytime feeder. Bed nets don't protect against it because they're smaller than mosquitoes, so they actually penetrate bed nets. Certainly, permethrin will slow them down, and if you have permethrin-impregnated bed nets or uniforms, they're a benefit. DEET can be protected against sandflies. Then, of course, long sleeves and pants tucked in the boots can be useful for preventing sandfly bites, but very hard to enforce in a very hot environment. During the war in Afghanistan, in particular, there was a problem. I got called from an ER physician in the northern part of New York who was seeing a Fort Drum soldier who presented to the emergency room with tingling along his forearm. 27-year-old, just got back from a forward operating base with Special Forces in Afghanistan. And on his plane ride back, he developed this kind of a strange tingling sensation and numbness in his right hand. Then within 48 hours, he developed disorientation, a high fever, represented to the emergency room, where he is found to be unstable. And I got a call because he was basically having what we call aquaphobia, where he was basically developing painful salivation when presented with water. The important thing about that was his history was notable for having a dog bite in his right hand when he was deployed to Afghanistan 7 months before. He didn't report this, and I was able to get a history from him before became obtunded. And he was a cook for the Special Forces. And they all had dogs at their forward deployment. And he had his own personal dog that he adopted there. But because he would throw the scraps out, all the local dogs would be presented to him because they knew there was food, and he would throw the scraps left over. There was a fight that broke out between his pet and the other dogs. He reached in, and in the process got bit. He didn't report this bite, and there was no documentation that he was given rabies vaccine before deployment, nor did he get rabies immune globulin. So he's admitted with what I described as hydrophobia, a fear of water. He also had severe neurological problems when he was exposed to air currents, so we actually had to turn off the ventilation in his room. Biopsy was done and was positive for rabies. Within 3 days, he developed extreme swelling of the brain. Then 4 days later, developed respiratory failure, and then died 12 days later from hemorrhaging in the brain. This is a typical CT scan MRI of the brain, which just shows this large amount of swelling, which is from the rabies infection. So rabies is probably has the highest burden of all the diseases we'll talk about today. There's almost 12 million exposures per year globally, high number of fatalities associated with it. And when you look at the global picture, it's really throughout Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, really every country except Hawaii has had cases of rabies. So all your soldiers who are deployed into these areas have a potential risk if they get bit by one of the vectors, which includes bats or skunks or dogs. In North America, it's still a problem. There have been 55 cases in the last 60 years, so these cases are infrequent. Most of the cases in the United States now come from domestic bat strains. These are the active reservoirs, so these are all reservoirs in the United States that are infected with rabies, including raccoons, skunks, foxes. So if you get a soldier reporting a raccoon bite or a skunk bite or a fox exposure, certainly those are reasons for giving them post-exposure prophylaxis. But also importantly, they are highly endemic in the bat population. These are bat bites that most people will not notice. Of course, you'll notice if you got bit by a bat. This actually can occur while sleeping, and if there's a bat in the room. We've had several cases, for example, a father wakes up and his daughter, they chase a bat out and they notice a little bite here, and that requires rabies vaccination. So one of the important features here, besides the symptoms, which include fever, headache, abnormal sensation around the bite site, is the incubation period. The longest recorded case incubation from a bite to clinical rabies is 19 years. So that's rather stunning. In the case that I presented, it was 7 months. So any type of bite should be reported and should be treated regardless of the length of time. These are just pictures of the more severe form, which this patient I described eventually had. It's also associated with 100% mortality. Things to remember is that the bite results in the transmission of the virus up through the spinal cord. So a bite in the leg, in the hand, the neck, or the arm can all result in transportation of the virus up to the brain and an infection. Protecting the soldier is easy because the rabies vaccine is highly effective. But to my knowledge, there's still not a policy in the Department of Defense to vaccinate soldiers pre-deployment as they go into areas endemic for rabies. Certainly, once soldiers report a bite, they need to report it right away. Irrigation is important, as well as sterilizing the area, and then giving them antibody called rabies immune globulin, followed by rabies vaccine, is also 100% effective in preventing rabies virus. The other problem that happened in Iraq was multi-drug resistant bacterial infections. So we started getting reports and seeing soldiers come back to Walter Reed with really serious multi-trauma from IEDs, amputations. And they were growing out a common pathogen in the environment called Acinetobacter baumannii. But the problem with this particular pathogen is that it's usually drug resistant to most of the antibiotics. And we were noticing that these were multi-drug resistant, which meant that they were getting resistant to every antibiotic that we had available. Once we started seeing one case, we saw another case. Eventually, we saw 50 cases, and we were wondering what was going on, and we started reporting back to the division surgeon in Iraq. And we realized that there was basically an outbreak that was occurring in U.S. soldiers, and particularly those who were getting injuries related to combat trauma, especially with IEDs. They were being air-evac to Landstuhl and Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And one of the really good things about our deployments back then was the rapid deployment and care of soldiers back from the area of operation to Landstuhl, to Naval Hospital in Spain, and to Walter Reed within a matter of days. This is a typical combat support hospital. Despite its sterile environment in here, it's still environmentally contaminated with soil because of the sand. And what was contributing to this was the rapid evacuation of soldiers, plus the use of antibiotics for prophylaxis, which resulted in the multi-drug resistant bacteria. There was there was needed to be improvements in terms of contamination of field hospitals, and then environmental contamination of airplanes and healthcare providers as they were deployed back to the MTF. Finally, let me just briefly talk about deployment of Marines to Monrovia, because I think this is a very interesting and important outbreak that occurred. So in 2003, 225 Marines were deployed as part of the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit to Monrovia, because at the time there was political unrest, and they were there to stabilize the political environment. Liberia, tropical climate. There was years of conflict. There's lack of a functioning government. There's poor infrastructure. And the deployed Marines worked and slept in an abandoned airport warehouse. Standing water was there. They were infested with rats and mosquitoes. During the deployment, the Marines were issued a supply of mefloquine, which they were directed by command to take every day. And mefloquine's hard to take because of the associated nightmares that you can get with that. So adherence really wasn't followed up for. It was based on the honor system. There wasn't any directly observed therapy. The unit spent 10 days in Liberia. Shows a picture of their encampment here. And then of the 225 Marines, 80 Marines quickly, within the second week, developed a febrile illness. 44 Marines were evacuated because of fears of malaria. 39 Marines were brought back to Navy Medical for treatment of uncomplicated malaria. 5 Marines were evacuated out to Landstuhl because they developed severe respiratory dysfunction, requiring respiratory support and ventilator support. This shows the outbreak amongst U.S. Marines. Anopheles is a female mosquito. It's a nighttime feeder. It's the one that spreads malaria. And malaria is endemic, especially there are 5 different types, but the one we're talking about here is called falciparum, which results in very severe cases of malaria. It's endemic throughout Africa, parts of South America, Southeast Asia. So that you require malaria prophylaxis anytime you're deployed. Malaria prophylaxis is highly effective in preventing malaria infection. The symptoms can be headache, fever, fatigue, cough, diarrhea, and then infects the blood cells here. This is the parasite here. And most will develop uncomplicated malaria, which means that they get very sick with fever and they need treatment right away, or they develop complicated malaria, which means you can go into renal failure, go into respiratory distress requiring a ventilator support. How to protect soldiers. Mandatory observed malaria prophylaxis is the most important thing. Education of soldiers and use of bed nets. This just shows, for your reading pleasure, the drugs that we have now available that are more tolerated than mefloquine for malaria prophylaxis. The U.S. forces, Marines were considered combat ineffective so they were pulled back. Command lost their leadership because of what they viewed as a lack of combat leadership in making sure their soldiers are protected from malaria. So in summary, in the last 40 minutes, covered a lot of material, but I think the lessons learned is that infections during deployment of soldiers will continue to be a cause of non-combat illnesses and troop readiness. Understanding the infectious disease threats and the regional threats are very important. Commanders should be briefed on what those threats should be, and it should be a priority in planning any type of military action. Education of the soldiers and their leadership on prophylactic measures should be a high priority. And then prophylaxis, whether they're drugs or therapeutics or vaccines, should be available and should be mandatory. So I thank you for your time and welcome any type of questions that you might have.
Hey, Dr. Indy, Steve Rutherford back again. Thanks so much. That was very informative and a lot of great information. You did have a couple questions come in while you were briefing. The first one we got, you can read them on the right, but the first one from Mr. Jeff Curry, does anyone know the reason for the 1918 flu high mortality rate for relatively young and fit troops?
That's a great question, and there was a big hunt to get the 1918 virus, and if you ever read the story, it's a detective novel. Actually, a physician out of AFIP at Walter Reed led that investigation. They went and dug up cadavers in the Arctic who died from the 1918. They actually took biopsy specimens from the lung, and they were able to resurrect parts of the 1918 virus. And what they found was that it was a unique strain at that particular time, which had some very important virulence genes to it, which made young adults in particular very susceptible with a high mortality. So the big fear is that the 1918 can come back, and there's a lot of research ongoing now to determine what those virulence factors are.
Thank you, Tim. The next question from Lieutenant Colonel Hurt, and it looks like Ms. Elizabeth Weaver kind of chimed in on this one, but he asked, are there other vectors of concern other than the Aedes mosquitoes or dengue? Dengue
really is only transmitted by Aedes aegypti and albopictus, and that's also true for Zika virus and yellow fever. Now, Culex is a very important mosquito vector too. So Culex actually spreads West Nile virus. It also spreads another type of virus called the Eastern equine viruses. So the Culex mosquitoes can be a very important vector, but it's not a vector for dengue.
Okay, and then finally, by the way, we've got the last question here. We still have about 5 minutes, so if anybody else has any questions that they've been burning to ask, just go ahead and type them in the box to the right. We got a question from Mr. Lewis Winston. How is leishmaniasis positively identified and treated?
So a very good question. So scrapings of the ulcer or a biopsy along the edge will show the parasite under slides. Also, there's a very good PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which is a molecular diagnostic test that can diagnose it very quickly. And then the treatment is bioinoroid. We used to have to use a drug called Pentastam, which is a 21-day therapy. It was very effective, but also caused a lot of side effects. But now there's a very important drugs now. Metefacine has been very useful. It's an oral drug. And then a technique that was perfected at Walter Reed was actually a thermal cure. So there's a thermal device that you can use to heat up the ulcer and basically kill the parasites in the local area. So there's a number of very good treatment options available.
And then finally, we had one pop in from Ms. Burgess. What is the situation surrounding tick-borne diseases?
So the tick-borne diseases are very important. We at Upstate have a very good tick-borne research program ongoing. So ticks are very important for transmitting diseases such as Lyme. There's another related to Lyme called relapsing fever, which I diagnosed in an Army colonel when I was at Walter Reed. It also is a very important transmitter of viruses. So in New York State and in upper parts of our country, there's two viruses, Powassan virus and deer tick virus, which are transmitted by tick bites. If you go to Europe, tick-borne encephalitis is a very important cause of infections of the brain. So ticks are very important, transmitting some very important human pathogens. And then there's a new kind of outbreak that's associated with ticks, which to all the meat eaters out there, this will cause you to be upset. So there's been an outbreak that started in Virginia, which has been growing. I don't know if people are aware of this, where a tick bite, and there was a protein that ticks secrete into the bite called alpha-gal, and people develop an alpha-gal allergy. And basically, what they develop, an alpha-gal is very rich in meats, like in steaks. So they develop allergies and anaphylaxis to eating steaks. And so far, there have been reported 3,000 cases of this so far. So this is a very interesting development with ticks. It's a tick-borne disease. My wife would be happy if I developed an allergy to meats, but it's an interesting phenomenon.
Then I think we'll take the last one here. Colonel Hurt had a second question. Is there any concern about re-emerging diseases, especially in light of the increased antibiotic resistance seen in many bacterial infections formerly that were under control? And if so, what bacterial issues are of most concern for re-emergence?
So a great question. Walter Reed developed a surveillance program to look at that for the emergence of antibiotic resistance. And it's a scary thing. I had a patient a couple of weeks ago who had multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas that was so resistant that none of our antibiotics, everything, including things that we use for backup like colistin, was totally resistant. We had to get a investigational drug to be able to treat it. So, people can actually, people are dying because of multi-drug resistance. So we worry about things like Staph aureus, because methicillin-resistant Staph aureus has become highly prevalent. 50% of our cases in the hospital now are all MRSA, and they're getting more resistant every day. Strep pneumonia now is developing resistance to our common antibiotics like ceftriaxone, so about 10% now are resistant to that. You have to use vancomycin. Klebsiella, KPCs are becoming highly resistant. There are multi-drug resistance like from gram-negatives out of India that are coming back to the United States. So these are all important issues and pathogens that we need to start to address. Use of antibiotic stewardship and controlling how we use antibiotics, as well as taking care of people and isolating them if they have that type of pathogen.
Super, Tim. Thanks a bunch. So thanks, everybody, for joining us today. As many of you already know, we give one or two of these webinars a month. Last month, for example, we gave one on a promising treatment for PTSD. Those were all on our website at hdIAC.org. If you want to get more involved in that sort of thing, by all means, go there. We produce 2 podcasts a month. We also answer technical inquiries. If they take less than 4 hours, we'll answer it for free, and you can access our wide range of subject matter experts to include gentlemen like Dr. Tim Indy. We also have an opportunity for customer-funded type work. Dr. Indy and his colleague, Dr. Stephen Thomas, when they were on active duty, had a very strong outreach program providing briefs such as this to units preparing to deploy. That's certainly something if you contact the HDIAC or me personally at srutherford@hdIAC.org. I'd be happy to set something up like that for you. And then finally, I encourage you to take a look at the website. There's an opportunity to sign up there for notifications about the podcast, the webinars, as well as receive the biweekly digest, which is a roll-up of significant news events over the preceding 2 weeks. And then finally, for those of you that might be interested in becoming a subject matter expert and doing things like Dr. Indy just did for us, you can also sign up to be a SME there as well, and that's what keeps us ticking and keeps us vibrant and relevant. So all of our information is contained in the chat box to the right. John Reed's put it there for us. And again, I know that time is valuable, and I respect your time. Thanks for giving us an hour today, and we certainly appreciate it. And hope to see you again here in 2 weeks. We have a podcast on critical infrastructure protection going on the 26th, and that's going to be given by Ambassador Rich Kozlerich and Dr. Tanya Thornton from George Mason University. So thanks much. Take care, and have a good day.